You know, I've been doing this for a year now. Not the channel, that's a bit older, but a video every week, every Friday, without fail, an entire year. Well, here we go again. Hey everybody, welcome back. This Dreadnought is one I kitbashed ages ago for my Black Templars when I was a little bit too poor to buy a Redemptor one month, so I made one out of a knight I had lying around and spare parts. Unfortunately, that means every other Black Templars Dreadnought also has to be made out of a knight and, spare parts. So this week we're going to be doing an awesome kitbash of a Brutalis Dreadnought. I didn't make a video for the last one, so I felt like I owed you guys for this kitbash, especially as it's so massively impractical. I started by building up the legs from the armature kit and then looked at changing them into a more dynamic pose. I want this guy to be running forward, a little bit like the Ragnar Blackmane character model, or even that Reaver Lieutenant. Just have a bit of a dynamic pose, especially for something that's essentially a blender on legs. After gluing the first leg together, I cut it in half carefully with a mixture of my clippers and a scalpel. I then cleaned up any rough edges after making sure that everything was going to fit back together. This leg's going to be pushed out behind the model where most of the impetus is coming from, and the body will draw a straight line from the toes to the top of the head. To do that, I had to straighten everything out, and I knew the join wasn't going to be particularly strong if I just glued the plastic together. So after making a few alterations here and there to make sure that everything fits smoothly, I attached a bit of 1mm wire and pinned everything together. I think these back jointed legs are really cool and add an awesome grim dark flavour to this kind of Dreadnought. The normal Dreadnought models are excellent, as are the normal Knight models, but this bash of Dreadnought and armature just looks so grimdark and I love it. The next step was to change up the feet. These are very flat in order to support the normal knight body, but I wanted it to be really dynamic, so I cut the front toe off and then angled it up. This is really going to help the flow of the model and allow me to lean it further forward. I also made sure to pin this because this is going to have a lot of weight on it. You'll probably notice I'm using super glue more than plastic cement. It's just a bit easier to work with when you have something like an activator on hand, and it means I can create strong bonds very quickly. With the left leg down, it's time to work on the right leg. The initial process is exactly the same, cut in the same join and tidy everything up. Now my initial plan for this was to have the knee raised quite high, like a human running. You have one leg up, one leg behind you, but the back jointed legs don't make this particularly easy, so we will see the design slightly change as we move on. I once again made sure to remove any obstacles in the way of the movement of the joint, so in this case the piping and then this little bit of plastic up here, just to make sure everything was going to fit together nicely and not have any huge gaps. The legs are probably the most important part of the model, so I spent quite a bit of time on these just to make sure that they were good enough to support the top structure. Once again using pinning to make sure everything is nice and strong. There is usually a comment or two on every video about what this is. It's called a wow stick. It's an electric drill with a terrible name. You can get it on Amazon. It's a little bit pricey, but cheaper than RSI, so worthwhile in my book. Once the pinning was complete, I built up into the gaps with a little bit more super glue and activator, just to make sure that absolutely nothing was going to fall apart. Throughout the build, you'll see me using dry fitting and positioning a lot just to get a feel for how things are going to look. I've been doing it on the legs already, and I'm doing it again here just to see how I want the foot on the right leg to look. I also dry fitted the foot to see what it looked like, and I wasn't particularly happy with how this was looking. It wasn't anywhere near as dynamic as I'd hoped. So this is where the position change came in. First things first, we make the foot a little bit more dynamic by removing the little nub that normally connects it together and then seeing how far I can push it back. If you look at a runner at full sprint, their feet are not parallel to the ground. I then cut away a channel in the back of the foot in stages to allow it to fit around the pistons. This was a multi-step process with constant rechecks, but once I was happy, I glued everything together. Now when it comes to my personal methods for kit bashing, I usually have a good idea of what I want to do at the start of the project. But sometimes you come across things like this where it doesn't quite go the way you want it to because the model is shaped ever so slightly differently to what you pictured in your head. But all is never lost. You can always refit things and see how they work together. I'd originally wanted one knee high, but I found if I tilted the right leg backwards, the model would have a lot more forward momentum. Now I knew roughly how I wanted the legs to be, I put the waist together and started dry fitting everything. I was treating this model as a tale of two halves, get the legs done and then I'll figure out the top later. Testing the fit, I was really pleased with how this was going to look. Clearly he would need some kind of tactical rock, so he'd have that right leg not brushing across the floor, but that was easy enough to sort later. Because I was happy, I glued everything together. Next up was the simple step of bulking out the legs and attaching all the panels as per the instructions in the armature kit. With the legs complete and looking really cool, it was time to work on the top half. This is where my plan was a little bit more fluid. I didn't really know what I wanted to do here, other than the fact I knew I wanted the armature body with the Dreadnought faceplate attached. So I did that off camera. For this process I had to figure out where the melters were going to go, because it's a Black Templar, of course he's using melters, and how I was going to attach some kind of armor or chin plate to the front of this faceplate so it wasn't just floating in the air. I also had to figure out how to attach everything to the waist without it being really close together so he'd bang his head on his legs every time he moved. And the solution was Tamiya barrels. These are really easy to pick up, you can get them from any hobby store or online, but generally I use them for stuff like this. I cut off a little area, glued it together and attached it to the waist of the Dreadnought. This is a really easy way to add some height and a little bit of bulk to the waist area. I then dry fitted the top half once again just to make sure he didn't look too silly, and once we build up a few more pipes and gears and stuff around here, it will look really good. You'll notice there's a lot of free space behind the faceplate and it's just kind of dangling in the air, so I'm going to use these little jerry cans, also from the same kit from Tamiya, to build up a little bit of bulk back there. This is another really easy way to use a really cheap kit to kitbash things. 90% of this is going to be hidden by the melters and future additions, so we don't need to worry too much about them looking very much like jerry cans when we glue them in. I kept playing about with the chin plate from the Brutalis kit and I ended up reversing it so that the handle was facing towards the ground and attaching it as the chin to the Brutalis. After attaching the chin plate, I realised we needed a little bit more bulk back there just to fill in those gaps, so I added a second jerry can. Now to disguise those jerry cans, I'm using one of my favourite parts. This is the heavy Hellblaster backpacks from the Hellblaster kit. If you don't make the heavy variant, you'll probably have a bunch of these lying around, and they're amazing for any kind of mechanical kitbash. I cleaned up the edges and burrs, and it doesn't really matter if they're slightly different to one another as long as those handle parts both face the same direction. I cut down the piping on the left-hand one just to make sure that everything was going to fit well with the waist, and then once again dry fitted to make sure that nothing was getting in the way of anything else. The process for the right-hand one was exactly the same, cutting off the piping and orientating the handles to the front of the miniature. With these two greebles added, it was time to add the multi-melters. There was a nice flat space on both sides of the knight and they fitted really well above the greebles I just added, so I glued them evenly there. As I was gluing these on, I felt that the model didn't have enough bulk to the sides. The Brutalis is a bigger Dreadnought than the Redemptor, and therefore I think it needs to be a little bit wider and, no pun intended, but more brutal look. So with that in mind, I added these side parts that usually cover the melters from the standard Brutalis kit. As I said, this is a massively impractical kitbash. If you already have the Brutalis kit, why would you do this? Unless you're me, but I think it looks cool. I also built up the arms and test fitted them to make sure they weren't going to look too silly. Now before we attach the arms and extra armor panels, it's time to glue the two parts together. So we're going to shave down this bird edge to make sure everything's going to sit flat and then glue the top half on at a nice angle. I knew I wanted him reaching out with his right hand over his slightly raised leg, so the body was tilted to the right to help facilitate this pose. And as you can see with the arms dry fitted, it's looking really cool, but a little bit round, so it's time to add some armor panels. I added these shoulder pads from the Brutalis kit as per the instructions. It was at this point that I'd also realised I'd not added the exhaust to the armature, and they need to have exhausts, so they look really cool. So I added both at the back and then started adding the front panelling. It was at this point the model started looking really top heavy and wide with the addition of those armor panels, so I took the shoulder pads from the Armiger kit and added them to the hips. This really bulked up the bottom half and created a bit more symmetry and balance throughout the model. With that done, I continued adding the standard armor panels to the top of the Dreadnought. Next up was the twin Icarus Iron Hail stubber. How many words can you fit in the name of one gun? I don't know, but I think that's what it's called. It's going on the top, it looks pretty decent, and it makes this model really, really tall. I then also added a few spare pipes from the Aggressor kit and the Hellblaster kit around the waist just to stop it looking quite so much like half a barrel. Next up were a few candles from March of War. There's this big slab that comes on a little base plate. I cut away the base plate and glued that to the right hand side, and then also added a few little individual candles to the left hand side. He is a Black Templar after all. Speaking of him being a Black Templar and needing loads of candles all over the place, he also needed tons of chain. So I grabbed this thick hobby chain that I got from Hobbycraft. You could probably find something similar at your local hobby store. It's essentially large jewellery chain, and wrapped it all over the Dreadnought. If you've seen any of my other Black Templars Kitbash video, you know I like adding chain all over the vehicles. It's just a cool little motif that is unique to them. Once the chain was added, I made sure there was a healthy amount of super glue all over the chain to stop it rattling and hitting itself, and also causing me problems with painting in the future. Once that was done, I added chain to both the left and right claws. At this point, I realised the model was actually getting fairly heavy, and I really like that because it is an absolute beast. For a few more little details and to add to the dynamism of the pose, I added a few long purity seals, and then I set to work on the base. Knowing I needed a tactical rock to make sure that right leg wasn't dragging across the floor, I added this big tank trap. Then I used my electric drill to drill a hole into the middle of the tank trap so I could pin the Dreadnought to its base. I made sure to drill quite deep into the leg so there was no chance of him snapping and falling over of his own accord. Of course, I wouldn't recommend dropping him or pushing him or anything like that. It is a miniature at the end of the day. After everything was pinned in place, I also added a healthy amount of super glue and sprayed it with activator around the foot just to make sure there were no whoopsies later on. And with the main kitbash done, all I had to do was add a few more details to the base using a mix of March and War bits and pieces and some old Games Workshop scatter. And that will do it for this video. This has been my favourite kitbash I've ever done, and I'm hoping he's going to be an absolute beast on the tabletop. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I definitely did. I've been Sam. See you next time.